Well, let's see if she does. So then, the question of can you see then that the story is not only you're healing yourself in something or getting rid of it no matter what, as if it's an enemy, but can you see also the dying and living that the cancer has now revealed to you? So, question, of course, the question is getting rid of it, but you're making it something that has always been there that you're just finding out about.
Right.
Yeah. And then if you examine it, you may see family has had it also, and you see that somehow it's always been in the story in some way. And so there's a date with an experience that you kind of knew, but then you find out. And finding out is a different story than that somehow you always knew all this time, but somehow you were keeping it hidden in your life or reversed. So then they say, so this question then, Marty, I say, then it's not around so much dying and living. It's when you recognize that dying is in the living becomes deeper for you. Because then you see that somehow, as long as there is something true happening for you, you have time.
Mm.
And that there can be conversations with the body. That's why people may start doing exercise a year, that they're expressing that they want to live longer. But when you're specifically doing this or that or eating a certain way, uh, then you're kind of specifically saying you'd like to live. So I say, if in fact you do have this love affair that he was mentioning, then the question is, can the love affair have a conversation? Because I don't know if you want someone hanging around taking care of you while you're yelling at them or something like that. So generally, love affair means that the left part of the brain and the right part of the brain talk to each other. And they're not so much separate entity, but they're sharing a feeling. And so then I say that come from the love affair. If the love affair feels it'd like to get an operation, or it'd like to get this or that, whatever the drugs you're talking about, that's coming from the love affair. If you're buying time, and it's not literal time, it's time to share this love affair between you. So I say it's hard to see because of the fear of loss of life, but you see that it's not loss of life so much as more meaningfulness of life. And meaningfulness of life just as second nature to you now, where you see it. You don't have to, you're not learning it or following it, but you see that it's coming from the life that you're in. Then you see that there's somehow there's agreements about living on that's actually going on in the regular life, but somehow it becomes conscious that you are in a kind of agreement, and that time is an aspect of it, not so much literally, and that you are spending a kind of time together as a metaphor for something else. Hmm? And that somehow you knew that inside yourself, that being created for the time that you're in, that you can't enter into the next phase from a false place, from running away or any of that. There's no trip going for you. If in fact something is, so your relationship is with the human feeling. Hmm? And that sometimes when the illness captures the person, then they're having an inner fight and an outer fight because they're protecting what is happening inside themselves from the outside. So cranky is not so dumb. Even though it seems, why is this guy so damn cranky or this? But you see, when you look at it and you have a private conversation or something like that, or an accidental conversation, you see how brilliant this guy has to be cranky. to avoid certain things that are happening.
Yeah.
So, so he's kind of, so I said, oh, is this whole weird story just one long plot that we've stepped into? And I said, well, it has many lives being lived in one life. And so sometimes if you have to do something in the regular world of where you have a persona, but somehow your body is aching so bad where you have to make believe that you're okay while you really don't feel well, you could see the normalcy of duality.
Yeah.
And then when you see not only duality, but maybe 4 or 5 personas simultaneously,
Yes.
you see how brilliant the whole mechanism is. And you see that mechanism, when you look at it further, you see is a mechanism of continuity, of survival. So survival, everything that you carry is also seeking to survive while you're seeking to survive. And so you don't know to what extent the body or is pressuring you towards an expression in life or something like this. You know, so there is conversations that are going on that are not a literal conversation. But when I had this goofiness of where I then saw my foot blown up like that or feeling swollen, it was more like a baby that you had to care for than there was. And so you telling the baby, shut up. And it was a kind of absurdity because somehow you had to care for it, you know. And so caring for it meant a weird thing is that you started to see your relationship to the body that you're in, not as just a given or something, but that there is in fact a whole remarkableness that this body has experienced throughout this time also with you. And it also has those experiences in it. So it's not only the literal memory that you'll run into, but when you forgive the story or give another impression from the story from a different perspective, and you say, well, what is the perspective? And I say, you have a kind of God or an energy's version of what happened. You look back in time and you see what happened was part of a larger story that was unfolding. And that the people were kind of clueless in it because they were karmic. Their attractions to each other and then they're breaking up with each other, both were coming out of a karmic story that they were in. But it was kind of experiential for a deeper story. It was almost like practice of some sort. But when you look back at the life from that perspective, you start to see the former life as a rehearsal. And that the rehearsal had to come from a really deep place in the story. But then there's also a point when the story is not literally a continuity, but you re-enter the story from a different place. And it happens normally. So Carrie, I would even say there are elements of that where somehow you see the feelings that connect you to a John and then how they can break over some slight or where it becomes a kind of slavery or expectation or something like that. And you see that break perceives a lack of respect for something that it's about. And all of these currents are going on in an everyday situation, you know. And so let's say then that something then frees you from the story, an argument or this or that, but it had a device in it and it freed the people where they can say screw you to each other. So it freed them from the story, but not actually. Let's say if you didn't hear for a couple of days or you had a vibe, you would go in there and you find the person that you may have just had this with dying or in trouble. And somehow everything starts to disappear. And somehow, to some extent, his life and your life become entangled. And you have to do something about it. You could sneak away and hide, put on a hat over your head or whatever. Holy shit. Or then you could open up a thing and call the cops or call this. Or let's say you have many avenues open to you. And you choose to look out for him. And that means that you go into the real world, where looking out for him now means literally this is what is happening from the medical point of view, where from the home point of view, he just needed to be woken up. How you doing? I'll see you later. But once it's in the hospital, you see that there's 10 things happening. And that the body somehow was letting go. So let's say if my body is letting go, it would say to me, why don't you go take a bath? It wouldn't inform me, but it would trick me into taking a bath, we'll say. Because it doesn't know if I agree with it. Mm-hmm. And then you say, what would it mean if I agree with it? Well, then I say I saw elements in the family of my father where he was calm and clear, but we all, the people who were involved and the doctors were making a thing out of it. But when you got there, it was simple that he had decided to stop eating. And that there were a few friends also who looked out for each other in those states there, but they had to keep it hidden from a larger picture. But that somehow they were pretty calm about it, and somehow they were that they thought that hanging out longer would be pretty dumb in the scene that they were in, or whatever. So,
yeah,
is that valid? Well, I think it's some kind of freedom that we all exercise without knowing it fully. That the decisions is not literally a decision, but there is a question about what is happening for the person as it's coming close to that finality. Are that you have elements for a period, are you still into it? So are you still into it is a kind of question that comes close to taking your temperature about a dialogue that's happening in your body. And so then they say what they're calling, that you see, then they say, okay, then let's give the immune system this balancing act between living and dying. And that it's juggling you, and that you are in the medium, that what you're trying to reach somehow is a balancing act. And so let's say your immune system is given this balancing act, that it responds if something's out of balance about the health of something. But then it also is seen that it can be tricked, and even these viruses can trick it into thinking it's something else or whatever. So you see that there's competition, and that this immune system is managing these competitive elements, even competition within itself, in its own body or circumstance. And you have a relative knowledge of it. You can drink this because it's good for the immune system. You can do push-up. So you have a relative idea of the immune system until it's lost or something, where then you have a problem with the immune system, that it's overreacting. And they say they call it overreacting, but let's say it has been for years living on the edge, maybe sick without knowing it, maybe having diabetes, or maybe having underlying conditions without knowing it. The body's been fighting it off. Or maybe it's living, that they say, under fluorescent lights all the time or something, and somehow the lights have entered into it. So let's say it's a primary of a juggling act, but it's a cooperative that it has. And you see that when you walk into John's place and find him in that state, you see that the arguments and the getting together and the makings up and the breaking ups are all part of that creative expression. And when it breaks up, it's because it broke up. It's truly broken up. The elements weren't there. When it comes together, and the elements are there. So you see a kind of love affair where it's in flux, but a word or a discovery can interrupt it. And there's a difference when it's interrupted, what the response is then to it. Okay. So then let's say I then get a call from Marty years later after, like my immune system says, you did this and you did that, and it betrayed everything. Okay. I say, holy shit. In my mind's eye, we're looking out for something. But then I say, in order to do the scene, it's going to be heavy. So I say, what's the underlying story when a break has to happen? But when the break happens, then you get a call and say, after it said, your mother was a bastard and you and then all of a sudden it says, I'm dying and this is happening and I go get it. Okay. And I say, well, dying is pretty close a state to coming back from preserving your scene. And I say, well, what does preserving your scene mean? And they say, if you have to kill the friendship in order to hide the form, and you see what's missing in almost everything is a hey baby honest conversation. Then when you ask me how to go into the operation, I say, if in fact you have a lover who's that close with you, then I would say, hey baby conversation. Do we want to share this experience together? And so somehow you're creating a stage where there's an agreement. And then you'll take the kind of treatments that are consistent with that feeling. That happens to be true, even though it's impossibly sounding crazy or weird or whatever. I do feel true doesn't mean literal truth, but that somehow with that feeling, it allows you then to go into the room from a different place. Now, sometimes that different place is lost very quickly into the literal survival, and the way the medical industry is built, it's an industry. So then treatment on that level means continued treatment on that level. And when you have continued treatment on that level, that means maybe 30% of your life is dominated by treatment. And I say, I don't know that. I feel that treatment is an aspect of it if you have a loving agreement beforehand, where the treatment then that you would take is an agreement, not so much coming out of your fear. So you're seeing that somehow you're buying time that's different than regular time. So the treatment is not giving you regular time. The treatment is part of a creative process that you're in. Mm-hmm. So then I see my father a bit differently, that he was in a creative process in one sense in that home. And as long as they gave him a space where he was teaching art and how to paint and this and that and having conversations like that, then they must have been having also relationships in that place too, generally. So let's say your life then starts to be measured from a different place, not so much about the medical aspects of yourself. But that's an aspect of it, that the person then who perceives their life may then decide to do this medically or not. But it's not coming from the organized fear in the world that's created collectively. It's a kind of agreement between lovers or friends. Try to find a way to hang out for another year. It may sound like a very dumb conversation, but I also feel it has profundity to it. Because the year is not so much a literal year. It's, shall we share our love affair? What's the medium that we have? And we say, okay, in the condition that you're in, let's see if we could creatively have 3 years where we share this deeply together. Mm-hmm. So I think from that actual perspective, having that experience where you re-enter the story It resembles more of a movie, even though it's literally happening. But to the deep actor, the movie is really happening to them. It's not a fiction. Okay. When you re-enter the story from the love affair into the story, and you see that cancer, and this is also in the story, you see the love affair is then looking at the situation from a different place. And when the love affair looks at the story from a different place, what it's sharing is a very deep experience where somehow your love is keeping it alive somehow. Not your fierceness, not your this, not, you may adopt all those roles, but what
Yeah.
it is that you're coming from a feeling that the other person can feel. Hmm? And so let's say that you have relationships that the other person can feel your experience. And that when you share this felt experience, then you go into a story from a different place. Not longevity doesn't mean living forever. Longevity means that you're alive long enough to share this experience. That it has a different life than the literal life. And so I say, okay, can it be perceived for the second before it flies away? And then we come back to literal time of rent money, this and that, and the literal time of how's things going, where the doctor wants an answer from you at the same time, and here we are, sort of floating above the form. And when you're floating above the form like an angel, you see the literal life is relative. That when you enter into the body, it's organized around literal time. But you see that, in fact, it exists in a lot of levels. So we'll say an actor inhabiting you sees your life from a lot of different perspectives. But none of them have control over the creative act. The memories that you have then are incorporated into your living. Not organized into it, towards a thing, but that somehow you start to see the original phases of your existence as almost a rehearsal. Where you then have experiences where you're coming in it, then you see now that your relationship with John has dying in it. And it looks for a moment like we're closer to dying than living.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you see when it is close to dying, then other forces come in, a literal force. Okay. But you say, holy shit, you knew that was in the story all along. That's why you had this agreement. So you knew it without knowing it. It wasn't written down in the paper where John says, look, I am dying. And you, right. So somehow you knew it and you didn't know it because it's not literal. But that's what a friend would do. So then secretly you see that, in fact, with your friends, you're talking about living and dying with them. While everyone has a logical life, you see that living and dying, when it comes to you, is in fact one of the main conversations that are happening for you, not whether you get a job or you.
Yeah.
So an aspect of why you were getting a job has living and dying in the relationship. But once it's awakened, then only part of it is related to a job, living and
Right.
dying and coming from a different place.
Yeah.
It didn't mean so much how long you lived or how this or what you had to do. You see that business or working or survival was an aspect of the life.
Mm-hmm.
There were other dimensions of exploration that were there. That resembles just like a baby finding out about its life while it's growing up. And so it's dependent on others to relay information to it that then becomes part of it. So it allows itself to, that information that it acquires over time and practice the same day over and over again, then becomes the person. But it's not. That's a navigation tool for there are other forces at play. And so there are other creative dimensions that are happening inside the body that are not organized in the same way as the literal self is. The element or the energy that runs through it is more experiential. So it sees each phase of the life as each phase of the life, but it's around a similar experience. So from some elements, there's confusion, which is a way of finding out, or somehow the not knowing allows you to make the kind of accidents or mistakes that may be necessary for an evolving story.
Mm.
And then there is a point, it seems, where there is the maintenance of a kind of continuity. And then it seems that there is another phase where dying and living are inherently part of the story because you're being viewed as dying and living. To some degree, the population you're in, the circumstance you're in, the relationships that you have are seeing you as dying and living. So they may be treating you as a dying and living person. Okay. So then you say, okay, there's a mirror reflection in some of that, where in fact you are dying and living, and you see a picture of dying and living, and to some extent, you see an irrelevance to the literal world as all the issues are going on there. You're starting to see more an illusion, and sometimes delusions hidden in the issues. So then you start to see, if you listen to politics on the screen or whatever, you start to see illusion going into delusion.
Mm-hmm.
Where the delusionary aspect becomes the reality, and people then have an identity around the delusion when identity is an illusion. There are many identities and many forms running through a person, their impressions, their feelings, their issues, their health. Okay. But when it literalizes around survival, it also blocks out its relationship to a whole. So the one thing that tricks it out of the survival mode is falling in love with the wrong person. And then falling in love with the wrong person, they usually have rules again. I was just reading what they do, how much they punish you in India, because they think that the men Islamic men are trying to secretly convert these Hindu or Sikh women. So there's rules against intermarriage. So again, they have to sneak out and do it. But then they can't get legally accepted. And so when they find out, they come to the house and they break up the partners and they charge the man. And he may get 20 years for
This is
intermarriage.
currently happening.
This was in today's paper about India.
Wow.
And it was around the Sikhs, and it was around the area we knew too. And the Sikhs now, but the Sikhs also were tortured by these very people when Islam took over India. The Sikhs were kind of tortured to become Islamic, and they resisted. And so that's why they have a population that they probably try to keep together. That's not even Hindu. The Hindus are probably, that's by law now, they have that in the country, that Hindus, they have this idea that Muslims are trying to secretly convert Hindus. And they probably are. And that same rule goes in, I think in Palestine, they said that they're resisting giving a passport or citizenship to a Palestinian who marries a Jewish person.
Isn't it illegal in India to try and convert people? I heard that from an Indian person. He said,
Becoming increasingly so as the government has become, when the government was trying to be democratic still, then it was trying to have that look like it was democratic. But now as the population takes Modi back on, then they are very strong that the Hindu that the Hindu population is in charge. And very strong, like they say, very like Trump in one sense, like the Republicans, and then they become very strong about their viewpoints. Who you could marry, who you can't marry, can you have abortion, can't you have abortion, or whatever. And so you see, you understand that they're managing a regulatory society. But then as you look closer, they're managing a society of slaves. In other words, if you had 50 slaves, then you would also say who they can marry, who they can date with, who they can go out with, because you would be losing your workers. And you know your workers would be trying to sneak away if they found a boyfriend or a girlfriend because they're in slavery. You understand? So they never look at that slavery. What would be the attraction to getting on a train and running away? The attraction would be because you're in slavery of some sort. And those feelings that then, the feelings that a venture or trying something or being in love or are released in that thing, it's not only stupid, it's stupid to the person who's enslaving you. It's like breaking out of jail. They think it's stupid, but it may not be so stupid if you're locked up in jail and you still want to have a human experience or whatever. So let's say they know it's not stupid at the same time that they call it stupid. They know that that urge is there. And the urge may not even be towards any big thing, but somehow it seeks to be free. And freedom isn't really spelled out because some could find their freedom in any situation.
Right.
But when it's suppressed, then there are certain elements that they could, for it to be suppressed is a kind of health because it is wrong. For those elements to then they become distorted when they are not expressed. So they've been trying then to bend the kind of humanity to fit into the rules of the game. And to some degree, that is true. The survival as part of the continuity you see over time. But then there are people who see something deeper going on that have a relationship with something deeper. And so they see somehow when the rules are not taking care of something deeper, but the rules. So you step into a trip. And when you step into a trip, somehow you're freed from it. But then also what happens when you re-enter the story, then you're coming from your own life. The life is not so much a karmic life or defined. When you come from that place, then your job is no longer so much around survival, where you see you have to suppress everything. Then you see the next phase of your job as you become back into it, because there's a human element that they're recognizing it. And it's not a job, it's a kind of shared expression in the place. Mm-hmm. And so the perception of something shared is different than something owned in slavery, because you have to do it. And then you see the next phase is, no, you're doing it because it's good to do. Okay. So I feel that when one comes back into the story somehow, the dominant principle of survival, even though it's there, is not the main. And so you interrupt something in the society and in the life that you've lived. You see much of it is organized around survival. And so much of the logic that makes is around survival. So if in fact it's not so much governed by survival, it becomes increasingly wishful thinking, magical thinking, all crazy thinking, where you then have to hide and sneak out in the nighttime to do the thing. But that somehow you're sharing something for the moment that is violating the story that you're coming from. That supposedly you're not supposed to have that feeling. So then when you look through history, you see that there has always been a struggle around continuity, keeping the slaves quiet. But then some of them kind of wake up to a kind of slavery. where there's something awakens in them. And it's not, you can't locate exactly what the alchemical process of that is. But one comes into the story from a different place. And you kind of see it, then it's from the life that you're living. And so once you come back into that perspective, or even have a glimpse of it, you've added also a creative dimension. So I say then, look then, Carrie, then if you were checking into John, it's because the feeling was the relationship, and but it's your call. As is, it's all our call as we hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So then I also see when we'll say Marty getting called and he'll call me back soon, then is about the issues that we've been talking about all these years is also in the story. It's kind of requiring you to come back from a soulful space. While there's also a literal situation that you're being faced with survival, you better do this, you better do that. And you see, if there is a hey baby conversation that says, let's try it, it's different than a medical thing. It's something that you're trying because you want this time together and you'll give it a shot. So let's say you come back in the story from a different place. And it may be wishful thinking place and it may be magical thinking place.
Yeah.
But I feel that somehow that if in fact you have the conversation with the body that way, where you then respect it for the life that it's also given you and work with you on, that there is a kind of conversation that would be like a lover or something, just cuddling or something, where you and your body are familiar enough to cuddle. You understand, and fall asleep, that there is enough faith in that the person will murder you or something, but that somehow you have enough faith. Then it's like being with a child or something like that, where cuddling is a normal, but you know how heavy duty you can get. You cannot get someone to cuddle if it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow there has to be a kind of truth, and it's not written like Declaration of Independence truth, but somehow the body kind of surrenders itself to a feeling.
Mm.
And so that's what kind of happens in the care when I say, okay, the treatment is secondary to the love affair. The love affair says, okay, let's try this treatment. But the person then is not forced to go into this situation with you, but that's an agreement. And that the situation that you're in is part of the understanding, part of the theater of your love affair. So you may choose to be naive in it and see if we can just be natural and stick with that. Or in fact, since you have all of the medical training, but you also see that from the perspective of the energy or the expiration, it's not only around a will to continue, but that somehow the love affair has you coming from a different place than continuity. It's around that there's a whole experience in this love affair waiting. And I feel that it's almost like one comes back into the theater of their life after having retired to some degree. You understand? And then one comes back. There's an invitation to come back from a purely creative expression. So how are you doing, Kerry, with that element? And so therefore, you'll see that you have relationships like that where you're caring for something.
Yeah.
Part of your premise of being there is that you're caring for something.
Yeah.
But then you also see that you're caring for something becomes your job.
Mm.
And then when you see it becomes your job, you see you're only getting $3 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's a very poor job. Okay. And yet it's very hard to say then to the owner of the restaurant that you're working in, I'm thinking of leaving now. And they say, what, you dirty bastard here? Okay. And it's partially right. You see, to some degree, they've kind of been dependent on the status quo with you. But at the same time, they know that you are a character somehow who leaves if it's not happening in some way.
Yeah.
And that may be like a bird that flies away if the temperature is not correct or there's no water there or something. So it may be that it has its own freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But as it lands into a community, it communizes.
Mm-hmm.
So then you kind of see the music you make, the affections that you have, the relationships that you have. And you can kind of see the song that you sing. What song do you like out there? When you're traveling the North Country, say hello to one who lives there. She was once a good friend of mine. Good friend of mine, a good friend of mine. Who is that now? Is that
I don't know
Dylan?
that one.
I think that may be Dylan. When you try, and I think with Johnny Cash, he sang it together with Johnny Cash or something. But they were saying when you're traveling through that place, knock on the door of someone who used to be a good friend of mine and say hello for me. What do you say?
Do that song?
Excuse me?
Didn't the Grateful Dead do that song?
I don't know. When you're traveling the North Country, sir, and the wind hangs heavy on the body line, say hello to one who lived there. She was once a good friend of mine. Good friend of mine. And then it's Dylan in the back. Good friend of mine. He echoes him back, I think. So it's kind of corny. There was another one that they had that just opened up the album. And that's all the wild horses in the sun. How you gonna get any riding done? And they just opened up the album with that. They had no more lyrics, but I think that's Teresa's phone message when she calls. You hear that? All the horses in the sun. But it does send a temperament. So the premise, I think, of that song was to knock on the door of someone that you used to be related to, if you're traveling in that direction. But you say it was the Grateful Dead that did that?
I don't know. Part of that sounds like a familiar, but they did a lot of covers. So
I think Dylan did it alone, and then he did it with Johnny Cash together. What do you say, Derek? Is that true?
I don't know that one either.
When you're traveling the North Country, sir. Yeah, I think it's the title of it. It does have a weird ring to it because it's countrified. I guess Dylan did allow a countrification to come in too, didn't he?
So the underlying sound of his music could easily lend itself to country, I think.
It's a whole, when you start to see most of the popular expressions, you see the accidents that they were. And how this happened and that happened and this, and then you also see a kind of popularity that comes out of nowhere. And the popularity that happened for him was that he stopped doing folk at the I think at Woodstock at the concert, but he introduced the electric guitar. And so that was a kind of, for most of the audience that liked him out of Woodstock around that time, who were folk singers and pretty popular as folk singers, and Pete Singer kind of, and that Dylan did come from that kind of socialistic, even if he came out of Minnesota, when he went to visit old beatniks and old poets, there were kind of socialistic folk songs, that he was singing. So when he introduced the electric guitar and started to come from a different place, to them it was commercialization. And there was a kind of selling out thing that was going on in the world with Joan Baez and others, because they were getting their experience with being affectionate. But then Dylan became Jewish, Hasidic Jewish, and then he became Christian, and then he was trying everything out, and all of these were expressing themselves, and then he was hanging out with the band. So let's say it was evolving. And it was more commentary on that evolution or whatever, of what the person is experiencing. And then there were other guys like Cohen that just had conversational poetry about what they were experiencing when they were lonely or what was happening to them. Almost by there's one song that Leonard Cohen had that my blue raincoat, my favorite blue raincoat, or something like that. But it's about his brother running away with his girlfriend and going out maybe to New Mexico to this, so, you know, and he's singing about his brother, and he said he came back with his wife. But it's interesting to hear. It's just more of a confessional of a private story. But then you see, as it's reflected on, it's no longer a private story. You see that you lost your lover, your wife, your brother ran away with your lover, and they were going to go to a vegetarian farm or whatever at that time while you were singing. So then you start to see that one's seeing the romantic aspects of your existence is to see your existence more where the self doesn't own the story anymore. And it starts to see the creative act that it has been. Alongside the survival aspect, you see the creative act that the life has been. And as you perceive it deeply, something changes in you because there is an integrity that comes when the life is a creative act. And there's a kind of integrity if you're making music, if you're there may be a survival aspect to making the music and to making anything creatively to earn a living. But then when you also see that as an expression of something deeply, then there's a kind of genuineness that you're concerned about in yourself. And you're managing that genuineness in a world that's coming from different places. It's not evil, it's not bad. But then you also see that the make a profit margin starts to define your creative expression.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a love affair that is creating something and then says, let's see if we can make a buck as a goof creatively, as something shared, then it's kind of coming from a different place. So somehow one in the creative field is always trying to engineer themselves so they don't sell out. And selling out is not spelled out. But even if you're living in extreme poverty or in the streets or whatever, and situations come your way where you're hungry or you this, you don't have that, you still are measuring selling out. And even if they're kind of forcing you to confess in a concentration camp or whatever, in your stupid mind, you're still measuring how much you can sell out. So something in you is not available for sale.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it would be logical, they say, just say it, don't worry. You see that something in you cannot, there's something it can't betray about its own existence, that it can share with the lover. But it cannot share even if you put a gun to your head, okay. But that somehow instantly you could share with a lover.
Mm.
But somehow, if it's not true, it would resist, or it would resist the compromise to some degree without ever exactly know. It would attribute it to psychological, structural situations, but you kind of understand that no matter how much they've tried to locate it over the centuries, it remains evasive in terms of knowing. Because it understands to that part of the psyche, to know it is to own it. will possess it. So that is why the love affair remains a mystery in the way it could affect you years later, and even in its absence or whatever. That somehow it slips past what you thought you knew, literally. And you see, even though something may be gone for years and years and years, it's coexisting. I was saying earlier today, I got a call from Marty, who's discovered he has deep bladder cancer. And it was a scary Marty, but not so bad. But then it was also a pretty soulful conversation. And he's having, he feels a love affair that is kind of with him in this. So then I was suggesting from a dumb way, maybe instead of looking at it from a medical point of view and this and that, maybe the love affair will look, because I'm imagining being a person who has to care for you. And I'm imagining Marty with his jokes and his this and his whatever. And then on top of that, he can't pee and he's going to be cranky and I'm going to be making lunch for him. And okay, I say, well, hold it. You better have a conversation beforehand. And I say, okay, and then he kind of understands that the situation is, again, hey, baby, do you want to try this thing? And then you measure what kind of medical help you want to take. So let's say if you take medical help that makes you too cranky at home, you may reconsider that. And I say, what would that be? And I would say tubes in your urinary tract. Let's try that for a start. Could you imagine, Urja, that you had tubes then running in the urinary tract? So every time you got up, okay. So there would be, and then if the phone rang, you would not ring, you would not answer it, you would, okay. So you started to see that somehow with that in your body all day, there's a kind of crankiness that happens when people ask you questions. And you want to be left alone because a third of your body is in a kind of pain where you can't really move or even speak. Well, okay. So you see, crankiness comes with that condition. Okay. So let's say if I have a love affair and the love affair says, let's not do cranky, but let's do a different kind of, we'll take ayahuasca healing and share it that way. So let's say the love affair comes from a different place. It may do medical and it may not do medical, but let's say there's a different vibe, it's not so much fear that's dominating it, but it's coming from a shared space. Then I think from that shared space, you look at the circumstance and you're coming more from the shared space deeply like that. Is not shared space like a motorcycle gang together. It's coming from a feeling that gives you a relationship, and the relationship decides to do something together. I think it gives a kind of creativity or spiritual element to the doing. So I think then if they ask a question about people in love, should they do this or not? I say people in love then can come from a different place. And whether that's love of life, love from the perspective that you bring, or that you're bringing that quality, or in fact it's a shared I and thou space, then the time spent together is not exactly continuity. It's around deep time, time of memory. So however much literal time it has, that time will be the memory of you. Where you understand that relationship is not only around the literal person, but it is in fact a fact of life, that once you experience it, then the absence of it in death doesn't stop it. In fact, it creates another conversation around it in memory. And in some cases, the memory is living. It speaks a different language. Now, the ability to visit that space is somewhat limited to the depth of the person who's experiencing. Because from my experience, you bring an aspect of that back into the regular world with you. But you again start seeing the elements of the literal world from that perspective of, I would say, the mirror looking into the world, where it doesn't have a history, but it's coming more from mystery. And as you see that the mystery runs through your life, and the mystery is not some complex thing that can't be seen, it's discovering something so stupid, something about a friendship, something about happened, reading a diary and seeing a love affair where it was happening at the circumstance, the shift that happens for you mentally, where it protects something in yourself. But at the same time, you see something revealed opens up a parallel world that you intuited, but that you kind of resisted in order to continue. So then you see through much of life that it's missing a heartfelt conversation. And you see for 100 years it's trying to have a heartfelt conversation by its own idea, psychology or this or that. But they think literalness means a heartfelt. And I think that heartfelt means where the karma, the past life, is no longer defining you, but there's a feeling that opens up a possibility between you. So when it starts with the heartfelt, and then as it literalizes and it becomes around survival, you start to see what happens in it. When the survival literally takes over, it suppresses what you started with, the feeling. And it tries to make it silly sounding when in fact that's what gave you an expression. So I feel that there are different conversations going on in life around survival as a continuity, but that there's a parallel conversation where that aspect of life, continuity, is a small aspect of it. It's around a kind of truth of one's life will provide. And there was a kind of intuitive sense around that the intelligence of one's life will create providing. And that element of the population who perceived that way tried not to sell itself out to literalness. So even if it had to get jobs, it made theater of the jobs. It would sing on the job, it would dance on the job, it would play, it would do this, it would have love affairs. It would humanize the job existence. So even though you were working in a factory of some sort that they had you in labor, you see there would be love affairs that would take place, flirtations, all these sorts of situations to humanize the circumstance. And that the boss would try to stop those things to get you to work. Okay. But somehow you understood that they were not just flirtations, they were not just jokes, they were not just kidding around, but it was humanizing the atmosphere. And that somehow they thought that the existence of something was based on this kind of labor, when as a matter of fact that people found a way to be human under all conditions. Even if they were about to die the next morning, they still found a way to tell jokes with each other the night before, to kid around, to argue, that still somehow the beings introduced what it meant to be human into the everyday. And that no matter how much it was organized and controlled and defined or whatever, even if it was in the military, it would then usually have a secret life. And the secret life then would have to become the sneaky life. And I say, why? Because that sneaky life that they're talking about will not be dictated to if something is deeply wrong. So it somehow maintains something that may be wrong for it by having an inner life, but it then has to hide that life. And as it's hidden, it becomes increasingly neurotic, except for those friends who it shares it with. So somehow the hanging out together in friendships around a similar situation allows a normal conversation around deeper elements of one's life. And I say, then you can have a conversation. Hey, look, man, if this is now all the trips that went on and everything, they were not bad. They were parts of the journey, but you see that you always made a move on the journey. But now you then have a question that has kind of reflection of soul searching in it. And it's around dying. But it's not so much around dying, it's around taking huge steps to prevent dying. That those steps look like dying itself, worse than dying to some extent. And so, but then you see, no, okay, then you're then coming from a different place where you'd like to live. That as a question, not that it's so normal that you want to live that you'll fight for it, but that there is a question. And there is a question then in the relationships that you have. And that's the question, are you still into living? Are you still like to live longer? Or how does it look to you? Questions that seem impossibly absurd are questions that are actually pertinent to the situation. Because then you say, okay, I deeply like to experience this relationship and where it's gone with it. Then you're kind of having an agreement, even in your own way. Because then if someone's caring for you from a feeling, not because it's a job, then you kind of entered into an agreement that's a creative act together. That may do medicine, may do this, it may do that. But it's coming from a feeling. So it's not so determined to do this. It doesn't violate a kind of creative behavior, which means that you don't lay a trip on it. Somehow the energy provides. And somehow I've kind of had to have my own crazy way if I go into the organized medical world in that way. I told you that time when I had the cancer there, that I woke up to find a chemo doctor that became a friend later on. At the end of the bed, and they were premising I was going to get chemo. I said, "Oh, I don't." But this, and he was in charge of the institute here for chemo for cancer there. But if he would have said, he was such a sweetheart of a guy, and we became so close here, that if he would have said, "Danny, please take it," I would have had to consider it just because of the feeling with him. And I say, why? Because I feel the feeling share with him would kind of be looking out for me. And I'm kind of looking out for him in some way, because I know he was having a struggle then. Since we all met, then he was having a struggle with this company that he represented. Because he also did see that in that world of chemo, they try to sell it at all costs. You know what I mean? Even so selling it is their big thing once it's out there. But that basically, he was starting to see where they were suggesting to doctors, just like in the opioid crisis, where they were suggesting to doctors and giving them a percentage from writing scripts for the opioids for everything. Even though that they knew that putting the Tylenol inside the opioids was causing kind of liver problems. That they then created drugs to treat the problems that they were creating. And you say, holy shit, you're stepping into a way. You just wanted something to get rid of your headache for a minute. And all of a sudden you step into an industry.
Yeah.
And how natural it is. But then you read the fine print and you say, oh, okay. So let's say we don't need to. We kind of understand that where you're coming from, the deeper where you're coming from, the more natural it is in its expression. Because then it's not, the deeper it's coming from, the more genuine it is in its life. So it needs that element of its existence to be in the lie, a consciousness somehow. So your relationship is with that consciousness. And so therefore, once it is with the consciousness looks at the story and then sees what the body is with and what's happening with it. Okay. But we're premising that somehow seen from a different perspective, where one has somehow a voice in it. The voice is not do or don't do. The voice is a kind of a naturalness of while you are in a certain situation throughout your day, you will surrender, and without your day, you will want to see something on a movie or something, and throughout your day, you'll be positive throughout. And in fact, you are taking the temperature of your body and your brain and the rhythms in it. Now, that may be happening in some form throughout your life where your systems are juggling living and dying. But when you become aware of that process there, they usually make a fear of it. But as you become aware of a natural process or a natural conversation that's happening, you then meet parts of your body that you can actually speak to. Just as if you then find out something different in the family that you can then return to the family and actually have a conversation about something that was impossible in the past, but then becomes natural to your well-being that you have then the family then agrees to an honesty within itself. It doesn't mean literally telling everything. It does mean not lying or not concealing when you know it will impact on the other. So you see that the lying and the concealing was a navigational part of life. But you also see the concealing of it then created a flux down through the situation. So let's say there is a natural caring for that is awakened. And that one is caring for a natural sense of freedom in the expression. That the thing shared between people is kind of creatively, voluntarily. And volunteer doesn't mean what it meant in the past. It meant that you're not bringing your history into this circumstance, where it's then repeating itself. It's not around survival, it is around the grace. Somehow your relationship to the situation is around the grace. Then it's around the literal story. When the grace is lost, then the literal story becomes dominant, and you can start to see it starting to fracture. Then it seems to me that it's rediscovered in reflection and memory from a different place. So let's say at that point for me, when I then meet a person in a different state after we've spent that time together and left, and then through a different time and different shifts happen where there's a mutuality, where somehow there is a perception of dying and living that is then entered into the story, where it's no longer possessive of survival, but it's around a kind of quality of experience. Then you see in the quality of experience, you then bring a different dimension than survival. You've already survived.
Yes.
This part of the life is not around the survival. And it has a different relationship to time and space. And that is somehow that there's an invitation that allows it to take a shape or an expression. And the invitation may be a face in the crowd or hearing something or a hey baby waiting for you, but that you see then that there's a feeling in you that touches the feeling that invites you or touches you. As I mentioned, a face in the crowd calls you.
Yeah.
And then the crowd becomes real. Instead of something to avoid as a crowd, it becomes then interesting.
Oh, Danny.
Yes.
Yes. I watched last night People Flow. It's by Wei Wei. He did a documentary about the people who are refugees.
Yeah.
And what he shows vignette of what happened to an individual, a child, a mother in that crowd. I'm getting goosebumps. Because it's just what you said was exactly that.
You know, when I had this life of drifting after I left the Navy, then a friend called me from Las Vegas, and I went out there, and then I had a couple of years of weirdness where you were then subject to everything. People were living in the street, and you see that they had people working in the places, but they had a few thousand young people all around there and having conversations with each other. Some people dancing in the clubs, or some people turning tricks or being party people or whatever. They're just strung out on the street. And you saw the conversation that happened there. And warning each other, the cops are coming, be careful, and this and that. And you see, it created a reality of people knowing each other and looking out for each other and fighting with each other and laughing with each other. Okay. But it was an unknown world. And you would find yourself in the weirdest situations, because then you would be subject, if you were homeless, if you were this or if you were that, you were then subject to people asking, who are you? What are you doing? They'll put you away if you're homeless. Okay. So then you find yourself also in almost like a bipolar world where just because you're in trouble, but you don't have a home, you don't have a situation, you don't have it, you're looking for that. Okay. So you have friends looking out for you, you have situations like that sometimes there, and you then find you thought you were alone in something, but you find a whole population in that.
Mm.
Or then years later, you fly then to an ashram in India in the Himalayas, which is so obscure and so many thousand feet away. And then you find out there's 100 people like you in the situation with you. So what it seems to be your alone experience, as soon as you experience it, you start to see, if my toe hurt, and I went online with the toe, I found 6 million people whose toe hurt.
Yeah, mine.
And what they're doing about things that I didn't even know about, 5-toe socks and things like that. I'm wearing now. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say as soon as you discover something, you find a parallel world. And you say, how come I didn't know about this? It was so obvious, or this or that. So you start to see things that were explored to some degree already.
Yeah.
And so you start to see in your own situation parallel situations. And then you start to see it even in the movies you may watch, where you start to see parallel questions coming.
Yeah.
I think we were just looking at something for a minute called Mary Kills People. Is the name
with the Chinese Ho, her name is Ho.
No, it's Mary Kills People. I think is about a doctor, a woman doctor who is a mother, but she also helps people die, I think. So I didn't get it completely. I just stumbled upon it. Mary, have you heard of it, Eric? Mary Kills People, but I think it's on Hulu or something. But it was a three series. I think it was 3-year series. So we'll see. But it was interesting. I wanted to tell you, Urja, about it because it may be that she's a doctor who then helps people who are in tough situations. You know, so it may be corny or not. I don't know. I only saw 5 minutes of it.
Yeah.
But we watched a few shows. All of them seem to be kind of mirroring the situations that we're in life. Yes. Who's living and who's dying and what's happening. Derek, did you ever get a chance to see John?
We're going tomorrow morning.
No. Did you speak to anyone?
No, not yet.
Okay. So you don't have a clue as to how far along it is?
No. Apparently he's doing speech therapy, though, John is.
Speech therapy, yeah.
Yeah, I heard Joan heard that, I think, from Carrie. So That's why we're not going today. We're going to go tomorrow instead.
Yeah. So let's say, okay, we're seeing in our friends and hearing in our circumstance people passing, this happening, that on a large scale. So it's not, even though it's still down the block or a few miles away or somewhere else or someone we know maybe. And even the people that I'm hearing about who have died or are dying, it wasn't always COVID that was the element of instrument. You could see that that was a condition that was happening secretly all along in the style of life and the circumstance that the person was in. So it was the illness that they had was more discovering an illness that was always there for a long time. That everyone kind of intuited, but would sublimate. Like you heard someone coughing very bad or whatever, then years later you find out they had this or that, but you see that you heard the news long ago that it was natural for them to cough like that and that their body was dealing with something. So when you perceive the body dealing with something on large levels, from fever to falling down to hurt to neurosis, you start to see a kind of system dealing with something and dealing with its own reality, even though it may not be a real, literal reality outside. The realities that it deals with inside is as real as anything else. If it's dealing with loneliness, if it's dealing with loss or hurt or empathy or anger or whatever, you can talk it out of its anger as if it's non-existent. But still, it seems to be that the feeling that it's having of anger is real. It's happening. The body's conspiring for it. The mind is conspiring for it. You then talk the person out of the anger, because for you, the anger is not really, it's not real. So you're telling the person they're in a state that has captured them. And there may be a real issue there, but the state has captured them. Okay. How's your luck? Can you talk anybody out of anger? Well, you weren't able to talk anyone about voting for Trump. I can't say Trump this or that, but Trump was a representative of a kind of stuff you didn't want in the world around you. You wanted at least the politics of the world to stop interfering with everyone's life and dominating and taking over, and help run the country in a way that people can live intelligently. But then all of a sudden, as it starts to organize the existence in some way and become oppressive, it starts to sacrifice your human feelings in order to run the country a certain way. So then when there's instinctive senses that people have because they've been enslaved one way or another, where they don't always go along with something, but it still has to make sense for them, or it has to happen in a way that is romantic or stupid or whatever. And you say, well, it's not exactly stupid because you're not, when you are living a kind of alone, creative life, then many of the things that happen in the world you are choosing to do. It's not automatically written into you any longer. So if you choose to vote, it's you choosing to vote. It's no longer automatically. So you're assuming the identity for the moment because something touches you. If you choose to do this, so the doer, so even though others around you may be on an automatic, it's not automatic for you. You're going into a world and you're kind of understanding that you're in that world, but you're not of it. So then it would be, in one sense, to me, it came to the do or don't, and then you have a God who says, I don't give a shit what you do. It's your call, it's your life, it's your world that you're living in. So then it becomes a question like, should you put on a heavy sweater because it's cold outside, or should you wear a t-shirt, or okay. So then it becomes a kind of a measurement that you're taking. that is not that different from cold and hot and hungry and not hungry and this and that. You're, I told you once before that doctor said that about certain foods, could you eat it? And they said, look, if you see that shit, the dog shit over there, you don't have a fight with eating it or not eating it. You see what it is. So when it sees what it is, it releases you from the story of doing and don't do. So then you also see the systems that exist around you. And if there is enough people looking at it, then it's kind of forced to have some integrity. I was reading about the narcotics production from the company Farmer or whatever, and how they were kind of knowingly selling it and pushing it, and then knowingly what was going to happen, and then even creating things that helped you get rid of the drugs once you got addicted, and so they were, but had made an industry where addiction was the purpose, because then you would be a repeated buyer. And how built in the system it was, when in fact it may have been legitimate drug treatment. But you see that they were planning addiction or needing it, when in fact, without all that baloney, there is a legitimate use then for most of these things. But when they had to make a pure person live a secret life or be sneaky or lie about it, and then everyone collaborating in this story, that you knew that you were creating a generation of drug addicts. Increasingly. And that you say, okay, even though there was promise in what you had created, then you also see that you marketed it in such a way that it wasn't that it was good for the person to do, but you created a need. You engineered in the body a neediness for this. So then you engineered someone who will be sneaky, who will lie, who will hide. And so then you created a generation of people who are hiding this addiction that they have, or they have to make believe they're sick, or they have to do this. So then I say, wow. And it was always there, of course. In plain sight, you can see it, but then something has to be exposed. Then you see it was planned. And you see what was planned, and they say it was planned that you would be unhealthy so that you would need this product. So then they say, okay, the treatment didn't cure you. The treatment continued the treatment. You had to keep on going back for more treatment. And so in that system that needs more treatment, you see it becomes almost a factory way of thinking. And that meant that you had to keep the person somehow never cured, but in a process of curing. Or there was one agreeable situation that they said, look, you can buy 3 years more of life if you take this. And I say, well, okay, that may be a fair thing if they offer me, look, you could have 3 more years and it won't interfere too much and we can do this, but then probably from that, your body will probably surrender. And I say, body, what do you think? And I could say that Kai says, no, okay, the body, they say, okay, body, you're gonna have radiation. They say, yeah, maybe not. But we're going to give you chemo, body, and it'll be good. You'll like it. It's chocolate chemo. So they make it sound like it's going to be okay. And they say chocolate chemo. I don't know about that. And so then your nose says, no, I don't want to do it. Don't count me out. So let's say you'll lose your sense of smell if you do it. And let's say parts of your body Is that too stupid sounding? If they say, look, you can live 3 years longer, but you're going to have these tubes all over you, inside of you.
Tubes, no.
Well, tubes mean that the things that you're doing normally, then you have to do from a different place, and then you see how weird it is to pee. Where peeing is normal. When peeing is not normal, but peeing is an event,
Oof.
and that it's like it bosses you around. Not only it bosses you around if you're shopping or something and you have to pee,
Yes.
but it bosses you around as the fact of your life that first you're a peer, then you're a person. The first thing you do and the last thing you do is that you're a person who pees, who happens to be a Republican or happens to be a Democrat, who happens to be a female, or happens to be a male, but you're a peer first.
Yes.
You don't think you would accept that role? Let me look at you, Urja. No, you would not accept being a peer first. What about you, Urja? Would you accept and say, okay, you can do everything that you've been doing, but you have to pee 20 times a day, and so that's going to be on your mind all the time. And you say, how about 5 times a day? And they say, nope, 20, 30, and they say, that's too much time to be captured by peeing. Okay. So you say you have your doubts about treatment if it includes, and they say, why do you have to pee so much? And you say, well, this is happening, that is happening, this is happening, that is happening. So you think that you would say no if you had to pee 20 times a day. What about you?
An awful lot anyway, but not if it's painful or whatever.
Like burning. On
Yeah.
fire.
If you drink a lot of water, you always pee anyway, but that's a healthy.
Well, I'm saying that somehow you are in a situation where you're making believe you're doing, but all of a sudden peeing takes over.
Yeah.
And yet you still can't go someplace. You still have, because you're in a crowd of people. So then you're saying, yeah, but meanwhile, you have a condition that they don't have. Okay, you've experienced that urge. Okay. So I'm saying having to pee is what we're talking about. And having to pee is a normal state, not just sometimes that happens to you, but that your norm is when you have to pee, then you could see like 60% of your day is organized around having a place to pee.
Or wearing a diaper.
Which is something that one would be kind of reluctant to do. Although it may be cool at one point. Okay. So
I don't know that I would trust those. It seems like they would leak. I don't know.
So let's say they come across that by having tubes put in you.
Mm.
But then those tubes, although they'll help you because then you can just pee, but then there is a kind of crankiness that comes with it. Because somehow it becomes your major. That's why we were kidding around in the beginning. I hope this isn't too crass. It's very spiritual, because somehow that kind of condition in you becomes the major part of your situation. And then you're spending your day trying to figure ways around it, or to comfort it, or to drug it, or to. Okay. But what it does do is remind you of the thing that's happening. And the questions that you're asking and are answering is that that question is going on in your body about how long it will live and what's going on and the juggling act that it's in. So you become aware of a conversation that's going on. And you see then that there is a difference between treatment and forced living, where you're kind of forcing the body to live longer by kind of torturing it in some way. Okay. So then you start to see, hold it. Then the medical profession runs away with something where treatment meant caring for the quality of life. It didn't mean a diminished life while you continued living, that you extended automatically. Somehow the person had to give their perspective. So then I would see why my father would surrender. Because while he surrendered to that, he was really intelligent with it. He was really healthy with it. Hmm? And somehow he was managing, but somehow there seemed to be an agreement in his body and in his friendships that he had to help each other out in that. And that the body also had a kind of agreement to help each other out, to help it so like all of the body got on board with it. And I say that when one surrenders in that way, the surrendering is the actual act. I think then the physical there's lag time. But you'll start to find out in people as they are surrendering to some degree, there's a process that's happening for them. Because the body, I don't think, or the immune system, or they don't fear death. They're managing dying and living. So they're also seeing that the dying will be a natural aspect of the situation that they're in. So in such a weird way, it's not only around the survival, but it is around the genuineness of the life in some way. Hmm? And in becoming the genuineness of the life, you don't see dying as an enemy. Of course, you're still caring for yourself and you're doing this, but it's care. It's not fear-based. It's care. And care meant that you were caring for the life force. As just as if you were sick, but you were caring for the baby you were carrying. So let's say we make logical a life force that you're carrying anyway within you. You're caring for that life force. And it's somewhat holy because of what you'll do to care for the baby is remarkable before it's born. And what you'll go through to save the baby or whatever, because you're saving the baby, so you're looking at it from a different place of an innocence. And so when you see that life force, in fact, resembles that baby, then you see there's an integrity in the treatment. And then you also see when the integrity of the treatment is lost by the trip around. So you understand that you'll do almost anything that's good to save the baby, to care for the baby. But when it starts to become artificial to such an extent, but you see, so then you also understand your relationship to that. So then you see also the experience that we had with some of the young folks in there, where she died in order to have the baby, where she did everything medical to herself so that the baby could be born. And you also see that that was very popular in Hollywood also for a period of time, or in many places of double mastectomy, so that the woman wouldn't taint the child when it was born. So they had a double mastectomy even though they didn't have cancer in the other, they presumed. And there were then groups of young people who got together after having that condition for the baby.
No, you can't nurse though.
Yeah, so then you see the challenge they had because they were natural also. And I remember also, it was like a prayer that they had, and they may have gone to that guy in Brazil, that Father Joseph or something like that, who blessed them or something.
Son of God.
But when it came to me, then I also gave some, things that represent Catholic things, like milagros that you rub, rub them, and somehow you transfer the feeling. Where you have the baby in a silver thing and you rub it throughout the day or whatever, and you kind of. So those were charms, and I think kids naturally had charms. They used to call it charms. And it resembled, I think it came out of a Catholic idea of crossing your fingers at the time. I remember that if you drop food on the floor and you crossed your fingers and picked it up, it would purify the food.
That's what your mom used to do.
Yeah, that you crossed your fingers. That somehow God was cleaning it for you.
Especially ice cream.
So let's say that having a natural relationship to something where it sounds logical to you. Okay, to some extent, it was you knew inside yourself that it worked. You didn't know what worked or what work meant or anything like that, but somehow you had a kind of conversation with something and you normalized it. When there was no scientific proof of such a thing existing, there was no, but yet somehow a whole foundation was built on a conversation with the mystery, with an energy. But then it says, okay, when God says, I don't know, who cares what you, then it says, okay, it leaves you to an experience where it's not decision making, it's where you're coming from. So I would say that somehow it's where you're coming from. If you see someone hurt and you go over to them, you've stepped into a scene that people would advise you don't get involved, don't do this, because then you're pulled into the story, but you also understand it's a naturalness for you when you're touched about something that the lives kind of connect. And when they connect, it allows you access. So then you see, like yesterday, I see somebody, they had a big sign that says, we have a family, we're broke, we don't know what to do, or something like that. So I saw when we went into the store that I was trying to save some money to give them because it seemed genuine. But then also when you run into a straight hustle where it's like a business and you got guys owning these people, okay, then you see how turn off it is. But once you see the human in it, there is a kind of feeling that doesn't spell itself out. Many people would advise you of being so stupid or whatever, but it's not exactly stupid. There is, when you see something that touches you, your life and their life is a shared experience in some way. And that's what I meant about Marty, where there's a love affair who then may say, okay, you want to try things that somehow most of us won't try. And I say, why? I said, because it has too much of a fear base in it. So then I say, but if that same conversation comes out of your love affair, let's try this. Because you trust a doctor or this or that, it's naive or whatever. So I'm saying, from my perspective, there's something in the love, affectionate expression that gives dimension to the doing. So when the doer comes from the self and the continuity, it's usually fear-based. Okay, or attitudinal based. When the feeling then comes from someone who's going to share deeply a life with you, and there's an agreement, let's try this, it gives a dimension to what is happening where the treatment is no longer treatment like that, it's a shared experience. And then when you look for treatment, you see that the treatment has a human element in it. It was a friend who offered it to you. So you see, when it comes from the love affair, you look for dimensions of that love affair in the treatment. A friend is suggesting. And when they're coming from such a deep place in themselves, a friendship, it affects you. It doesn't mean do or don't, but it touches you in a different place. Because then there is a truth being shared, a true feeling being shared. So the doing or not doing that comes out of the feeling is qualitatively different than the doing that comes out of fear around survival. The fear of survival usually isn't a cooperative. It's me over you, Okay. But if in fact you then take into consideration that the lover will have to be in love, and for the person to take care of someone in such a situation, they would have to be in love with you. And it's not with love with you, but that somehow they're not a prisoner in the story. In fact, it is touching. I feel that somehow that feeling enters into the literal story. And that feeling has more of a question of a conversation with a God energy. That sounds like praying.
Yes.
But it's like the child praying. So the child is praying from an innocent place, not so much a motive oriented place. And so when a conversation with an energy is taking place, or it's a conversation with God, it's not asking for anything. That conversation means that you're in a state yourself. And when you're in that state yourself, the normalcy of your life is that conversation with the energy. So then from that perspective, you want it to come from the energy. That the person really wants to do it. Or they're into it. And you say, who needs anyone doesn't want to do it anyway? So you start to see that you're meeting energy fields in what seems like simple conversation, but it is the conversation that is avoided in life. But I'm not talking about a psychological need to have a conversation. I'm saying that there's a creative conversation when people are on a similar frequency. And it is around the quality, the grace of their lives. How are you doing, Roger? Still into it?
It's uncanny you talking about that. Yesterday I was with a friend who is going through so much with his body. He has seizure and nerve problem. And we're lucky we were in a booth, so nobody could see, and he started crying, and he was so much. And all I could do is take his hand, and it seemed, and that did something. He started to just relax and cry. Nobody was looking. There was nobody around, and it felt. Sometimes that's all it's needed. If it's, I felt that's all I could do.
Well, the doer is, you bring that energy into the room. The doer is more the seer, someone who's sharing something, who sees what you're, because to the rest of the world, that life is hidden. Or it's made into a medical state. But when you meet it personally and privately and affectionately, you're meeting it not as in a medical state, but where it sends the person. And so you're meeting a person in a kind of hidden life that is kind of watching the world go by, because there is something that is happening to it where it has no place to go. Even if you suggest, let's go shopping, right? It can't do any of that. It may not even be able to watch a movie with you without having its own challenge there. So you see where what is happening to the person becomes the main preoccupation of their existence.
Yes.
And so as you meet the person, you see they're meeting you from that screen, that this movie is happening to them. So as you meet them in that experience,
Yes. Literally.
that's what also happens when you have a room full of people who are sharing that element together. And you see, they say, oh, the family's coming. What are you going to do? And They all laugh because they share something that is hidden from the family when they visit. And you see that they've naturalized the experience. Where living and dying and treatment and not treatment is natural to the situation. And they'll have conversations about, should I do this? I wonder if I should do that. And they say, no, you may lose your sense of something or whatever. So you kind of understand the person managing their life. And in the management of their life, they want to retain certain sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
And that sensitivity can be as normal as wanting to see your grandkid. You understand what I mean, Kai? Where there's a natural, they say, okay, I'll take the treatment because I want to see my grandkids are coming over this week. Okay. And I say, why? Because there's a soulful situation in grandchildren and grandkids that doesn't have a history, has a mystery to it. So let's say the person can say to their body that they'd like to live a bit longer because their grandchildren are coming to visit next week. And they say, what kind of magic is that I can say my grandkids are coming over next week, so I want to live? Feet, stop it with your stuff now and stop it. And I say to my body, I want to hang around. What a dumb conversation, and yet what a beautiful conversation it is, because it somehow has a magical element to it where the body will listen to you.
Mm.
Where somehow we say next week the kids are coming over to visit.
Mm.
And somehow the body will listen to you. And somehow you could have an agreement somehow. And you discover somehow a conversation that is going on anyway. And that you give the body that you're living in credit about your own life. And you see what kind of body is it that can live a week longer if it knows its grandchildren are coming to visit. How can it do that? By what means does it do that? It's not medicine. It's not. I say you may meditate, you may take a walk, you may do anything that you wish, but somehow you do see that somehow if there's a soulful conversation, if there's something that you're really deeply looking forward to, and you see that the body is also deeply looking forward to it, and that somehow that conversation can affect the expression that you're in deeply. And it's not just around stupid things that happens, but basically just to feel you can travel, people can travel 1,000 miles to watch a football game or something like that because they cheer for the game. Okay. So you see, if they have that enthusiasm, all of a sudden they can do things that would seem really absurd or impossible. And you see, if in fact I've seen with some of these folks, if the grandchildren are coming to visit, that they can do impossible things.
Hmm.
And that somehow you could present the body to the grandchildren that you'd like to be able to play or to goof around or tell jokes or whatever. So you start to see that somehow that much of the life is actually a creative process, not only a literal process or a medical process. And that when there are genuine expressions or genuine feelings, there is a genuine response. But genuine doesn't mean coming from the fear of dying. Genuine does mean a recognition of dying as being a graceful part of your existence. And it does no longer treats dying as a boogeyman or as a monster or to be avoided or to be killed or to be, but you give grace to dying. You give grace to the dying and living process in your life. And you recognize it. And in recognizing it, it's like recognizing one of your children for having who's lived suppressed or repressed or hurt or some hurt feelings, but you recognize what they brought to the story, and you recognize what consciously it brings to your existence, where there is a where the body knows that it's living and dying simultaneously. It knows the juggling act is in and how it's keeping and everything together. And so somehow the body is very aware of a living, dying process that you're engaged in. And that it takes its own temperature throughout the existence. And as you become of that creatively, and that's sometimes if you become a writer or this or that, you become aware of a living, dying process happening in the life. And so from the author's perspective, it is seeing the organized life from a different space. It sees elements that are running through the life that are hitting to the literal life. And that's why I say, as you discover family and circumstance and what looked like a hidden life, but you saw other dimensions that were going on all along. And you start to see the creative dimension running through the life is even stronger than the survival dimension. And that there is an element inside of one that is on a journey. And that element that is a mystery inside oneself has a relationship to the mystery in the universe and the world. So it has moments that are accidental, because it is on a kind of search or a journey to find its own being in another, where it's not another, but somehow hidden in the story, you discover a dimension of your own existence in a love affair. And you see, the love affair is not a literal love affair as a possessive. It's something that opens up a kind of freedom in the situation that you're in. Because there is something in the being that must be free to fall in love. And even though there are rules against it and laws against it, you see that somehow it must have that experience. It's always searching for that experience. And in finding that experience, it has to be deep enough to have a broken heart, because somehow then you enter into a world where the broken heart is a sign of the integrity of the situation, that you couldn't have had the broken heart unless there was a true feeling that ran through the story. Because then the broken heart that comes without the true feeling that ran through the story is kind of saving your life from a false situation that you've been repressing yourself anyway. So somehow the true energy inside of one won't allow a life of repression for itself. So it finds a way out of something that's false for it. And false doesn't mean literally false, but somehow your creative dimensions are suppressed. That's why I was suggesting to Marty that this time that the treatment come out of the love affair. Especially since I think that there is the woman friend is coming from what's that woman guru in upstate New York that came out of Muktananda? Who?
Guru Mai.
Yeah, Guru Mai. So I think that's his lady friend's teacher, maybe Guru Mai. Although Guru Mai became very popular at a certain point there after she was a little girl when Muktananda was alive with her brother there. And so everything has a history or whatever, but basically I've been hearing quite a few. Have you gone to see Guru Mai, or you've heard of her, Kai?
It's a tough one because there are so many really not nice stories about her and her brother, about what she did to her brother.
Yeah.
So no, I haven't.
I remember all of that, but there's a lot of folks in show business that are seeing her.
And her brother still has a thing going too. He still has an ashram in New York.
You know, I think I saw them when they were kids, when I went to see Muktananda. Muktananda, well, you had a connection to Muktananda through your teacher. He was involved with Muktananda, wasn't he? But then also,
Yeah. And I still have a strong connection to Muktananda, but I don't have a connection to his.
yeah, no, what came out of that situation was weird. But then we also were, Muktananda's guru was there in Rishikesh there, that every morning you heard him on the radio in the morning, you know what I mean? So, but Muktananda did, in Woodstock there was, we were living in someone's home who was a follower of Muktananda. I met Muktananda, the big story was about that you had to drink bathwater of his or something like that. But, you know, so the stories were nuts with most of the teachers around that time as to what was happening with them privately. You know, and so there was a thing, and the stories were probably correct about the brother and sister were competing with each other at a certain point. But that also may have happened with Krishnamurti there, where the brothers competing, or but they were just kids. They were just kids originally with Muktananda then, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she seems to be an advisor then for people who are kind of in that world. Hmm?
I don't, from what I've heard, she lays pretty low these days and nobody really sees her.
Yeah, I would say that there are scandals in every one of the stories. You know, in retrospect, so there was a scandal a bit in Muktananda's story,
Mm-hmm.
and what was happening, you know, and so on, and and sometimes when you did walk into the story, they had a weirdness to them, many of them, you know, when you ran into it. But boy, oh boy, as I say in all the stories that came out of the situation in that time or whatever. But I think that one time that Muktananda had said then to the fellow not to support Doctor, because Doctor was talking, he spoke.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of the gurus were pissed that he spoke. And one guy described him as a shake and bake. You put something in the box and you shake it and it comes out as a cookie or something like that. So you put shaken, but you put someone from India in the box and it comes out as a guru. That was Guru Bawa, I think, in Woodstock. And then someone came and defended Doctor at the time and what he was about. But then you had so many situations, but it was a lot of it around Muktananda was very popular at the time. But then again, your teacher also came out of, who was the young guru, the 14-year-old kid?
Oh, I don't know, but that was pretty early.
Yeah, I know it was early because we know there was Sitaram that was one of the guys in Rishikesh, that Hadwar, that brought him over.
Yeah, well, I think he also had something to do with bringing him here, but really in the early days of his.
Yeah, no, that it was.
I don't remember his name.
Yeah, no, it was. We were asking him not to do it because the mother of the kid wanted the son.
Oh, right.
So not him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And there was a fight going on in Hardwar, and it was too corny.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was something with Sitaram. It was Sitaram that was one of the factors that brought him over. He became, I think his book is The Beverly Hills Guru.
Oh, I
Or
don't know.
Beverly Hills Jewish Guru or something like that. But at the time he changed his name to Sitaram. And then I think he may be Puri now. They may be Puri, because what happened was the organization that Spiro came out of, the Yoga Society. What was that Yoga Society? Well, anyway, they were going to have what was that? Ashtanga Yoga was going to have a Kumbh Mela in New York.
Oh,
They
right.
wanted to put a Kumbh Mela in New York, and they asked me something about it here.
That seems pretty bizarre.
And then who was going to help them was this fellow Sita Ram could give them these gurus that wipe them, that walk around naked with ashes on.
God.
So he was going to bring them. So he does have a picture, I think, on YouTube of him taking some hash with these guys. And we knew one of the women who was part of that tribe also joined us in India and married Shanti years ago. Chewy, her name was Chewy.
Mhm.
So she sells stuff from that tribe there, but that tribe is in every Kumbh Mela. And so I think they were going to have money to bring that tribe over to do something in New York. So when they were asking me about it, I said, I feel that the Kumbh Mela was something that was original to India, though. If you're doing it in New York and you're putting billboards and you see who's behind it, Madonna may be one, but you also see Donna Karen is going to have a billboard,
Oh, jeez.
um,
Oh, my.
and they say why? I say because then Ashtanga Yoga became $1 billion enterprise. And once it became an enterprise like that, where it was going to teach it in schools and this and that, but it became a corporation. Then you see that once it becomes a corporation, they have scandals and everything else starts to happen also around it. Because in the beginning, it was just people hanging out.
Yeah.
And then once that hanging out becomes a corporation or a church, then it's looked at from a different place. And I say, because the hanging out had a kind of, at one point, a purity to an honesty to it. And of naturalness, where it was natural for people to hang out around a feeling and shared life. But once it became a business, and it literalized the business, it brought motive to something that somehow doesn't have a motive. You relate or you fall in love because you're touched. So when it has a motive of survival, enters into the story, you could start to see the structure will start to dissolve.
Right.
Some incidents will happen or something will happen. Because the naive energy that allowed it to happen is not only naive, it's not stupid. It's deeply intelligent. It allowed something that was inherently hidden in the story to happen. So when it becomes literally around survival, it starts to lose contact with an essential energy in itself. You okay, Urja? Okay. Was anyone else on? It was just us, a few folks here today.
Well, let me see who's on YouTube. We've got John Kowalski, Henry Reed, Jason, and Jonathan Holman. So yeah, we have some people on here, 6 people on YouTube.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions about this idea that somehow a kind of deep friendship allows you to step into a parallel world where it's coming from a different place than the literal world around survival? So I mentioned one point, the kids that have come our way are kind of our kids that are born free to find their expression, to find their voice, not so much having a karmic voice laid on them. So for us, parenthood is not ownership. It's a kind of caring for or looking out for their creative freedom, to find their life, to find their expression, where it's not so karmic. So to us, the kids are not so inheriting a karmic past, but our life has had some kind of creative elements into it, that the children have come out of the story not so much from the continuity of the story, but somehow that the children were born free, and that somehow our relationship was to them was to care for that freedom in them. And so it was a caring for. And then you also find out that you've been caring for that freedom in your own life. So some of the issues you may have with certain events are around where that freedom is distorted.
Yeah. That's for
And so
sure.
somehow you may not be able to sign a contract that limits that freedom.
Yeah.
When the contract is around survival at the expense of the kind of truth or creativity in oneself, you see that the conflict in oneself is not bad. It is an intelligent act. Because that also, if your life is a creative one around singing or expression, you understand when it becomes clunky.
Yeah.
And you see that the song or the verse won't come to you if you're in that state, that somehow when it's clunky, you know that you've then slipped into because your fear of not making money or something like that. So then you creatively, it's not a bad or good thing, but once you are in the creative life, then you start to understand those measurements. Where the money flow is part of the creative process. But when it literalizes into the money and fear comes and all this, so then you see that there is a measurement in you that is taking stock about your own authenticity. Because somehow you know that your relationships to that, the face in the crowd out there, someone who says, hey baby, or whatever, has to be genuine. And somehow you're knowing if you're going online or you're meeting people or you're touching people or you're sharing something, that somehow it's not an act in you, that it is genuine coming from that. And when some element happens where the genuineness is lost. So this is the questions I would say that Jai is having then when she's caring for certain celebrities out there, is that somehow there is an attraction to the genuine, but also you understand the industry fears genuine.
Yeah.
And it tries to make a movie of genuine or a character of genuine. But you
Right.
understand that as you go into the story, you start to see the compromise that they're forcing on the situation. But there is so when you are caring for people who have a relationship to the genuine, and then they also have a relationship to the survival of the business that they're in. But they got the business they're in through being genuine.
Right. Because that's the attraction.
So then you also see that a viewer will start to see when it's selling itself out.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
So some incident will happen. So some incident will happen that reveals how much of a creep they had to be to sell out the situation. I mean, if you then had to sell out the situation, then you had to sell out the kind of prison of the circumstance you're in that people would suppress or pressure. So somehow when you're in the creative act, those in the creative act with you are on a board, there's an agreement happening. That there is a conversation creatively going on. So I feel that, so the questions that will come when you are advising people who are stuck in the circumstance, that then the conversation that I'm having with the cancer and then the whole procedure that they're going to get and what they're going to get, what they're planning to get, and yet you see there's a relationship in it. So then I'm imagining I'm in a relationship with this guy as he was, a cranky guy with all this happening to him. My caring for him is not a contract. My caring for the person is coming from a different place in myself, that there's a genuineness that we're sharing. So you see there's a need for a genuine conversation about, hey, baby, are you into this? Once you see if you're into something, then you may see the procedures that you may try. But if the procedures come out of the fear, then they tend to dominate the circumstance. But if the procedure, if someone who loves you says, please, baby, try this, then they're giving a dimension to this thing where they're having you look at it from a different place. So I say the love affair is different time. It's time to have the whole experience. That may be a minute, it may be a year, it may be, but then the conversation we were having today about, and the kidding conversations that we've been having with Urja and Jai and myself about let's give it another year or let's play with 3 years. It wasn't literal time. It was as long as it was human to you.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you were in touch with the human aspect of it, as long as you see that time was relative. But you see, when it comes out of fear, then time is literal.
Mm.
So when it's coming out of a love affair, the life is not a possessive, it's a shared experience. When it's coming out of the fear, the life then becomes a possessive. And I say, no, the life is a kind of agreement that I'm in. I realize that there's an agreement going on in my body and my being. And that agreement is happening independent of me. But there may be a moment when you see that there's the agreement then includes something you don't really know. That the body's not automatic. It is managing an experience. And there are hidden experiences in the body that are not logical, but that one is kind of hanging out for. And I think that once it becomes clear to some degree, there can be an agreement with time where you can have such a dumb conversation with one's own body, where you say, where you're kind of getting, just as if you're doing something creative together with a group of people or whatever, you then see your body as a group of individuals. Not so much individuality, but a group of individuals that are doing it anyway. They are agreeing. The body is agreeing to cooperate. And the body even agrees to compensate, to look out for each other. If one leg is hurt, the other leg will look out and take on more of the work. There is a thing happening that you become aware of. And the awareness gives another dimension to something that is happening anyway. And I feel there is this creative conversation about living and dying that is happening. And just as if there would be a marriage that one is into, you see that you would put up with something in a marriage that you're into, that you would then find a way to get along with it or to navigate as long as you were deeply into it. But that if you hated it or didn't like it at all, you see how irritating it would be. And yet somehow if there was affection, it may even be humorous. So then you see the difference in caring for someone and have affection, which is like caring for yourself or caring for a feeling you share and being required to do it. Where the same thing becomes a job, but it's not the same thing. It's like caring for your child, in one sense, the naturalness of it. Where there's a natural looking out for something. When you become aware of that energy in your own being, there is this instinctive caring for it, just as if you were caring for a child who doesn't see what you see. So in caring for the child is because you see a future, you see a coexisting circumstance. So the caring for them is a kind of looking out for, not ownership. Because in the caring for, you're also caring for a kind of freedom to have a life in the child.
Yeah.
That they have the wherewithal to discover something, the mystery. And once you perceive how the mystery runs into the literal story, then you see the difference between the mystery and the history. Then you even see throughout the history of humanity, you see the mystery that's run through humanity and then the history that's run through it. And you see in the history how little the population knew of its own mystery.
Yeah.
That only 500 years later or 200 years later do you see that it was a mystery that ran through the story. So then you tell me about the normalcy of Muktananda. You tell me the story of the Guru Maharaji that came in that shot colored water on everyone, whatever. And then we see the normalcy of that situation. And you say, okay, you've had that experience and you walk through that neighborhood of that experience and you see all the people that came out of it and what they did. And we've normalized the experience. And you say, okay, we went to India, we went this happened, that happened, you almost drowned. You found that guru, you did this, you had love affairs that came out of it, a whole life came out of it. Just people. And yet that experience entered into their life that somehow they were able to suspend their circumstance where logic wasn't the ruling thing.
Mm.
But that supposedly there was something to see, something to learn, something to immerse yourself in. And then when you find out the personal stories and what happened, you see that these characters had as much problems as anybody else did, even more so, and that it was tough going.
Mm.
Because when it kind of exploded, there was a broken heart in it.
Mm.
And you see that it became about money and it became about survival and it became about the regular stuff out there. But you also saw there was a thread that ran through the story and that it falling away was a very important experience. Because then, as we were discussing so often here, you saw the holy shitness of the story. That somehow it was holy. And what was holy was that there was a journey that was going on in your life. And that journey then would bring you into relationship with other characters who are also going on with a journey in their life. And yet all of them were still people while they were going on this journey. So there would be people situations. But you also understand that the journey, it was still a journey that was going on. It opened up your life where it did give you a dimension or a seeing of the life, where somehow you were aware of parallel existences. And that if people shared something deeply, something creative happened between them. But at the same time, it couldn't be fake. Somehow it was shared. The shared experience had to be, it looked naive to the world, but it had to be true in some way. We'll use an example of saying, having cancer and going to India and then someone saying, hey, baby. The hey, baby invitation had to be a true invitation. Because then the invitation was compelling. Would one come back from the dying experience if there was a loving experience inviting you? And I say, sure, I'll come back and try it. If, say, you're getting ready to pass away and someone says, hey, baby, why don't you hang for a while? Would that affect the body, the being, the senses, where there's a genuine, and you see the genuineness, because who would want to take care of a sick person or have a love affair with a sick person or whatever? So then you see the genuineness of the invitation is compelling. And you see that somehow, if someone makes that invitation, your body can get healthy again.
Mm-hmm.
That health was not gymnastics or anything like that. Health is the ability to have the experience. And so when you come back to the existence with that invitation, life is coming from a different place. It's not around survival. It's having the depth of the experience. So then you see that there was a force out there that wanted to experience what it meant to be a person. That there was a kind of God energy or energy that then came back as a person to have the experience of what it means to be a person in the story. Because when you're viewing, we'll say from a spaceship, you're viewing Earth, it's hard to understand what it means to be a person in that story because all you're seeing is the science of it. And we'll say if God is looking at the story, God doesn't see what it means to not have the rent money.
Mm.
God doesn't see what it is to be lonely. He says, what the hell are you doing? But then from a God perspective, you see that loneliness is an important experience towards an authentic experience. That there was a difference because in the loneliness, it then takes you into the world of aloneness, where aloneness is not some illness, but aloneness has a relationship to a true love, not a needy love.
Yeah.
So you see the needy love had a need to continue. But the love that comes back from a feeling of having died and come back into the place is coming from a more genuine experience. And I think those are the pictures that you would see with Krishna and gopis and this and that. It wasn't around sexuality, I feel, but around sensuality. And that the way the sexuality is organized in the world, it prevents you from having the love feeling in that way. That
Yeah.
sensuality meant that you fell in love and then you may have had sexuality that came out of the love affair was different than the love affair that came out of loneliness. So the loneliness then possessed the love affair as a psychological experience. But the naive, hey baby invitation into the world had it as a love experience that somehow the hey baby experience had a power, but it had to be genuine in some way. So I feel even if dying was in the story, there can be a hey baby invitation that shifts dying to in a different way. Where it's not your death as a possessor, but the dying and the death represents more the ending of the movie. Somehow it lives on in people's memories, the movie. Somehow they may make another movie of the same movie with a feeling in it runs through, but somehow it lives on. Now, whether it literally lives on or it lives on in memory or absence or circumstance, or a reincarnation of itself. But I think when it's a reincarnation of itself, it's almost purely coming from a spiritual place. And that is that somehow an angel wants to see what it is to be a person. And then all of a sudden, there's an experience that you're having where the energy then comes into your life. And I say, even kidding around with some, if I had to do that person that they were talking about, it would be Academy Award. Because if I then had to come into that life without the history as the person, there would be such a creative process for me to assume the identity that you would then understand creative process in some way. That the creative process is coming more from the mystery than the history. It gets a touch of the history to get a sense of what is happening. But it sees what's really happening is a mystery. And it's a mystery to everyone in the family. Unless they lose the person or something is happening, and then they see a deeper dimension that was there in the family, but the family is literalized as a knowable. But then you see the family in loss or this or that is not a family, but you see it has the experience of the dimensions that it's been in. And that there are times when it would sacrifice its own life to save the life of the other as normal.
Mm.
When you meet dimensions of your existence in that way, where you see we've normalized something that's pretty remarkable, that you may, then I'll say, look, Marty, it would have to be that you're coming from where I'm, what you want from me, I want from you now. And I say, why? Because then I'm looking at a dying Marty that then moves in while I'm dying.
Mm.
And a few other folks are dying or whatever. Okay. So then I say, well, hold it. I did that automatically in the past, but now the automatic is based on a mutual perception. And that would be love is sharing the experience. As dumb as that. And I say, love is sharing the experience. Then see the kind of spirituality in the experience. Not doing something, not suicide, not this or that, but they understand that they're sharing something deep that has no lying to it. When you go into the agreement where you understand that living and dying are inherently in it, because the person may be there or may be dying or living or whatever, you see that something, you re-enter it with a different kind of integrity around the story. That somehow there's a genuineness in living on that level. But it's not that you're literally caring for something medically, it is that you are sharing an experience. And so when a love affair shares dying with its living, something's out there. Maybe segue. I think that we've had some new folks come over that may take care of the grounds. You know, so we're interviewing them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But it's been quite interesting about nothing here. Hmm? Now, you were also asking about coming out here. That's your call, Urja. Just that you always have an invitation, but
But
when you should do it and not do it is always weird. But I'm saying that you know that that invitation to hang is there,
thank you.
you know. But so there's no one saying you got to do it or do this. It's just that you're free then, and that everyone pretty much that we're talking is pretty free, that our lives are somehow connected.
Yes.
But it's not a half truth or whatever. It is in fact a voluntary act of being into. So I think next week Eric may be coming, or in a week or so. But then
Is
I
it
think that, Janet is going to see her her daughter in Washington,
Washington?
maybe in Washington, Seattle, with her friend there, and so that should be interesting for her too if she goes there and goes traveling. And then she's pretty much like Kai. She's not. We've kind of have a non-vaccine, do vaccine kind of circumstance in our life that we're just juggling. The people are free. Sometimes it can be like a God statement where you say, God, what should I say? I don't give a crap what you do. So it's not giving a crap. It's trusting each other's judgment, basically, to care for something. But then you also understand that in many cases, the kids will get on your case to do something that you normally wouldn't. And it's also true if they say, like Jai's daughter, that she has cancer, that somehow you have to, or that Johnny D, for him not to be vaccinated, and Carrie had to get. So then it may be an act of love or affection. So it's not so much rules written in it. It's still somehow an affectionate situation that we're in, and that you're caring for something. So it doesn't have a literal. We're neither Republican nor Democrat. We have a feeling for a human feeling. So then whichever one speaks of, comes closer to a human feeling, then we can be that for a while. But that somehow you have a relationship with the human element that runs through the story. And then you see the history of humanity and how it's been repressed and killed and hurt and wounded, but that still somehow there's a thread of humanity that runs through the story. And that when you have experiences where you re-enter the story from the human, that you're human before the identity, that somehow you had an experience where your problem in life is because you've been human and you've seen things that would be hard to be with. But that made you an outsider because it was normal what they were doing. So then when you ran into life, that it was normal to imprison people, to embarrass people, and you understand that to have slavery or whatever, it normalized. Then you see that you had a break with that world in some way. Because your survival was not so dependent on you suppressing your humanity. So at this point in time, we see that there is poetic time and literal time. And poetic time means that there's a certain sentiment that you may have where you look at from your memory, you see the life from a different place. And you see hidden in the literal history of you is this other parallel story that's been going on all along. But you also discover that also hidden in those that you've known has been also this mystery. And that in order to have the experience, you had to have feelings for each other. And in order to shift the experience, you had to lose those feelings for each other. That somehow the experiences that one was going through demanded that one be genuine. And then when those feelings part and they're violated, you see that the genuineness in the circumstances departed. And so then you see that when something ceases to be genuine, it then has a repressed life, a hidden life, where everyone in the circumstance is keeping a secret life. That some occasion will manifest, and something will manifest that reveals. So when there is a common feeling that creates an expression, if that common feeling shifts or is lost, the expression is also changing by its nature. Then some event, I think, will happen that doesn't change it, but the event itself reveals that it's changed. I hope this is not too abstract. Okay. So as I say, Marty is going through a living and dying challenge around some, but then again, we know that.
Where does he live?
I think he was in England on his way to Italy or something. So I think he's
In Europe, yeah.
And I think he's having a relationship with a woman whose husband was a pretty famous director of Italian movies in the past. Pretty hip Italian movies. There was a time when Italian movies were very hip. I guess French movies were also, and then also the movies that they were making in America, the Cassavetes sort of movies and things like that, where they were, hipness was the underlying condition, you know what I mean? So where they ask questions about life and love and this and that in those old days. Yeah. You okay?
Thank you.
Is anyone else still on, Kai, or are there?
We have 3 people. John said, enjoying this immensely. Friendships can be portals to timelessness.
Yes. And so when it's somehow that the friendship in its naturalness is sharing a parallel situation, that when it's lost, depending on how it's lost, if it's lost in death, there is still a relationship that goes on that is being shared in memory. If it's lost in betrayal or something like that, where the person then had to choose themselves at the expense of, then there are dimensions that are hidden in friendship that have the range just like in the love affair. If the love affair was there, even the dying as another dimension hidden in memory that is released. It was always there, but is released in memory, and you see that somehow the body is an aspect of the experience, not the totality. It doesn't own it. So it depends on how that feeling is shifted or lost or what happens to it. If it's lost in dying, it continues. If it's lost in make-a-buck world, where one is competing with the other or whatever. So let's say then, in order to maintain a status quo, one has a secret life that's hidden. So then you see the conversation, even with the dying, is based on a kind of truth in the love affair. So that somehow when I use a dumb thing, like I was going, when I had that notice of cancer, I was, in my mind's eye, I was going to the Himalayas for a little stash place to die as my own movie. But then someone says, hey baby, why not? And you see they mean it. Because, and how do they mean it? Because you see the genuineness of their suggestion compels you. You see something that's kind of hidden in your own life, that you can assume identities. And when there's a genuine invitation, you see that you can then assume so then the question says, well, you want to go to Himalayas or you want to have a love affair? You want to go to Himalayas, love affair? You want to talk to Shiva? What do you say? Or do you want to come in? And you see the genuineness of the invitation is compelling. That Shiva himself would come back from being Shiva if the love affair was strong. And then you start to see the Shiva Shakti stories or the Krishna stories, or even the Jesus and Mary Magdalene stories. And you start to see even the kidding around that movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, where it's boyfriend and girlfriend, and then having a relationship to God and what you're supposed to do and what you shouldn't do. But you see there is a conversation that is actually happening in one's life that way. And when there is a genuineness in the invitation, it leaves you, choicelessness doesn't mean helplessness in that way. Choicelessness means that you see the illusion of the duality in yourself. When something touches you deeply, the being touched deeply then includes it in its own life. It somehow becomes, there's an I and thou experience that you have. And even when you fall in love with something, that becomes a thou in your existence. If you fall in love with poetry or you fall in love with any creative thing, you see that somehow now accompanies you in life. And you see if you're having a love affair, that even in the absence, it accompanies you.
Yeah.
And you're actually having a conversation as if both of you were speaking to each other. And so that also happens in the deepest sense in dying, where the physical death has released another dimension of the story that was no longer based on the survival or the story, but was based on having shared another dimension of experience that's hidden in plain sight. So when people have that experience, they can't kill the other. They can't bomb that country. They can't, they can't, because once they have that experience with the human, the world may consider them fools because they're coming from the human place in themselves at the same time that they're attracted to them. Because you understand that the literal world is dependent on survival to such an extent that it keeps a secret world all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you discover that secret world in the other, it comes as a shock to your system. Even though you kind of knew it all along, you see how one will compromise the creative element in their life to survive. But then you'll start to, as you read histories of survival, you start to see how people survived when they were repressed or tortured or tormented. And there was a nice little movie that we saw where called Steal a Pencil, Please Steal a Pencil for Me.
Yeah.
And that was whereas the guy in the concentration camp, he asked her, she worked in an office or something, and he says, can you steal a pencil and I'll write you love letters?
Mm.
And this and that, you know. So they were finding a way to be human. And so then you'll start to find out when there are places of oppression, then you'll see that there are some friends who share another dimension of their reality that they hide from the others. And they share their humanity with each other. And when you share your humanity with the other, there is somehow, when it's lost, when somehow it's betrayed or lost, or you are sent into a shock of the system, even though it may be natural that the person would choose their own existence, but you also understand that friendship has hidden in it dimensions, that when you lose contact with those dimensions, it feels like a sudden loss. Because everything that they know, then they've shared with you, which would be empathizing, may be then anger and hurt and striking out. You see, it turns something where the friendship allows you to see this other dimension hidden in plain sight. So when you see that friendship, kind of the root word of the friendship is freedom. That people somehow, when they get close together, reveal dimensions of their existence that are not only psychologically run, but they reveal their yearnings, their longings, their creative hopes and wishes. And as you're meeting folks in that, you also discover that dimension in yourself. You see the many lives that you've lived, not only the literal life of survival as an identity, but you see the many lives you're living even in the moment. And that even in the Meshuggah, if you're watching Netflix, you see that you're creating a theater of experience for yourself. And that the choices you're making, of the things you'll see or witness, are those that kind of reveal a human element, where you see the world to some degree from the director's perspective, from the actor's perspective. And when you see the world then from the actor's perspective, you see then the kind of rehearsal you would do before you go into the story, how you would have to refine elements of yourself so that you can genuinely express creatively the story that you're in. You would want to know what the person felt. And the person who we're discussing would even hide that feelings from themselves that you're exploring. So you see then in the creative expression, there is a desire for genuineness. And you see what kind of intensity you would have to locate a genuine thread that runs through you. And then I felt that I was running into elements in my body where there was a genuineness in my immune system that had a no bullshit conversation to it, where you saw that somehow the life was not exactly your life as a possessor, that much of it is unknown.
Yes.
And that's the everyday existence is unknown that one discovers, and usually in retrospect, because the ego would get in the way and try to correct it. But you see then that the life itself is a creative process that you're in. And that creative process sees your normalcy to be amazing. And you discover in retrospect that your normalcy was pretty remarkable. even though it was a normal life that you've lived. You see in retrospect everything that had to go through it, and you start to see that existence is much more creative than it is literal. And you see in that the mistakes, the accidents, the hopes, the schemes, the dreams all had a dimension to them. That somehow failing at something was a doorway of perception to something. That it allowed you a reflection on something that you normally wouldn't have had. Okay, I think we'll say bye-bye today. You okay?
Yes, thank you, Danny.
And we'll see if, in fact, in the future, because Marty wanted contact information also, but I said, take it easy for a while and call me from then, you know. But that basically, as we connect, there may be more contact information. They were wanting email or something. Because I think he said she wanted to get in touch also. So I said, before then, let's see what you guys have with each other, because then basically, if it comes into my story, we're going to kind of start from where we are. And that is the journey of life that you're caring for in some way. And so, and that is also that each person who then steps into a situation is a voluntary act.
Mhm.
So there will be, what you did know about Muktananda and this and that was there was a quality of yearning that came out of that situation. You know, so at the same time, the storyline may not play out where you discover that the person is a person. Like anyway, but I would say that the yearning that it revealed is true. And that thousands of people created a life expression coming out of that period.
Mhm.
You know, and so the failure of the expression is kind of written into it, because you're going to run into a conversation that you would have had if you were alone with Muktananda in the room with a couple of other people. And you would have seen that there were still human challenges in the circumstance. So then it would even be a conversation. Let's say you had a conversation with Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the mother and everyone else and people hanging out, and you were hanging out there. You think you could have such a conversation, Kai? That Jesus was in the room and Mary Magdalene's in the room and the mother's in the room and they all have their point of view. And you say, Mary, what do you feel about this story?
Mhm.
She says, I don't like the manger deal. I say, you know, Mary, if I were you, I don't think I'd like the manger deal either. You know, if that was and that was the agreement, what was the agreement? And she said, my agreement was that I was a fallen woman out there with a baby, a pregnancy, and that they had older people who then kind of adopted people who were in trouble, who fell out of the religion because of that. And so then I said, holy shit, could that be Mary, Jesus, and Joseph? Joseph was the old man who was looking out for them. They went to the manger. They didn't have a home. Then some philanthropist, wealthy, wise men then gave them a place or something like that. But basically, they say, holy shit, they sound like homeless people. The beginning sounds like, okay. And that did Jesus come out of that circumstance? And what was it like? And everyone living in that kind of neighborhood and circumstance. And so you start to see, I think it is religious. And I'm thinking that some of the experiences that are happening deeply for people now, I think they are having religious experiences, regular experiences. But that it is profound, the happening that is taking place. So let's say you can find out in regular people a religious experience running through the story. And as you find out with most of the celebrities that you meet, you're also finding out that they're regular people at the same time.
Yeah, I found
So-
that out at a very young age, luckily.
Yeah, so in finding that out, then you find out people who are managing their career moves at the same time that they're coming to you with honesty. And so then you see the challenging of Jai, of how difficult it is to have an honesty and yet then fit into the agents and all the people who are managing the story. So then there is a desire in that world to come from a free place, a free experience. Because you see how organized it is.
Yeah, I mean, if they're artists, I think they all started from that place.
Yeah. But once it literalizes, there is a yearning that's corresponding. So then you seek a kind of friendship. Or you have a relationship that somehow shares an intimacy that allows you to do that world to some degree. So let's say we're all our lives now are creative ones. None of us are literally having jobs that way. None of us are literally having, somehow, each of us have found some way of keeping it together creatively and still retain some essence about where we are. So we have parallel lives being lived. So then let's say I'll know, to some degree, you'll know the challenge that Jai will be up against around certain moments there. Okay. And then because you see, oh, how the hell did Jai pull off doing? And I say, for me, it was purely a creative act. And then how did Urja pull off this living in Boulder, Colorado? There's a Buddhist across the way. They can go here. This one's going. So how did you? And I said, because there was a certain time, I think when we met, that the life became a creative act, not a literal act any longer of survival. So then you just, at the time when we met, then you didn't just have a boyfriend to survive, but there was an easiness of hanging out where you could have a lover or a friend or a boyfriend or whatever, and you see that somehow one can slip into that circumstance from a common feeling that you all share. So coming out of the communities was also an ease at relationship. But I also say that many of the philosophies like Children of God and even Muktananda afterwards, and there was a flirtation that was part of the atmosphere. Where then, even when you went to, with Rajneesh there, you see that 200 people, young people together or whatever, making music, goofing or whatever, there was kind of instant relationships that would come.
Yes.
But in something like Children of God or other things, they were actually teaching the young people to flirt as being part of the philosophy. So that somehow you can walk up, it's not like you're selling them something, but somehow you can do Jews for Jesus, or you can do this, you can make up any of the names or whatever. But then somehow you can have a conversation. But you also saw that what they were teaching was flirtation. That you would meet. And the flirtation somehow invited people then to come into the story and to meet and like that. And I say, I think that it's not exactly done, because I think that was also done in the acting, in the theater, in the writing, in interviewing another for your book or whatever. There was a kind of flirtation that wasn't literally flirtation, but it was a kind of friendship or an intimacy. And sometimes those friends, especially in the Rajneesh place or other places, would decide, you want to try this thing. So then I found in India another time where then it happened naturally that there would be a kind of love affair or friendship that came out of the circumstance. And then people will find themselves going to Australia, to America, going to France, or trying this, people who just met each other. And then somehow their life started with each other. A whole new expression started. That was kind of a holy relationship, even though it was normalized at the time. So flirtation wasn't just a trip. Flirtation meant that when you had a feeling, you had a shared life also. Where somehow the relationships came out of an immediate situation as if it was normal. And then an expression came out of some of those relationships that were remarkably creative, and yet they were more normalized in the circumstance. So when I say flirtation and flirtation, it wasn't flirtation so much as that somehow you met in a space that looked out for the person. But as my memory was that it was so easy then for then the people to say, young people to say, together in the, hey, you want to go to America? You understand? And you say you didn't have that money stash, you didn't have this, but somehow the naive feeling allowed you to try something that then became an expression for you. And that was that somehow you were caring for the other. You were looking out for the other. And somehow looking out for the other became an expression for you. You were aware that you were caring for an energy. And then you understood when that energy was there, it gave it a natural life. It gave the creative expression a naturalness. But when the feeling was lost or something was betrayed or something, it lost contact with the magical aspect of the feeling. And then the situation literalized. So then with many of the teachers at one point, you had a guru that was remarkable, and then you had a crazy old man who was, okay, it was nuts. Okay, so when you saw two things, where something that was beautiful became bullshit over nothing, just a simple act where you see that it wasn't true or something. You then visited parallel worlds in your own universe where you could see certain feelings allowed you access into another world that was hidden in plain sight. And as you experienced that, you saw that there was a difference between the survival character, and the survival also meant its history, its story, its family, its background. And then you also saw there was another creative dimension that came from the mystery of one's life, not the history. And when it came from the mystery of your life, it introduced you to a parallel world that has been there all along, of a mystery. And it also introduced you to people that you thought you knew, family, circumstance. You saw the mystery that was there. And the mystery was that they were just people doing their thing. But the discovery of that turned it from logically surviving into magic. You even then meet your parents, not as parents, but people who somewhat tried to care for you while they were having a challenging life themselves. And then you meet people who had to hide themselves from you in order to maintain a circumstance. And then you meet a mystery that was hidden in plain sight. But you also discover that before you were literally born, there was a you in someone's mind, in someone's feeling, in someone's body, before there was a literal you. So let's say the mystery of you and the history of you run parallel. As soon as you take a shape, you then start to assume a historical you with a literal identity. But then there are experiences that you may have in the world where the literal identity falls away. And you see that someone may have fallen in love with some element of you. So then you start to see the differences between the literal you of survival and the literal of you that may be attractive. That what's attractive to you is the kind of soulful energy in the story. and that somehow you've attempted to have a life around it. Okay, should we call it a day? I'll see you soon. We may watch this show. We've been watching a couple of weird shows, but that Stranger Things with these kids,
Oh,
that is a strange show. I don't know that we'll
but
see it.
it's, I mean, at the first
Yeah.
year, it was pretty good. With Winona, isn't it? Winona, what's her last name?
Yeah,
What's the
somehow
mother?
we're stumbling upon some things and just hanging out, but things are up in the air and shifting also. So we'll see. Maybe I'll see you tomorrow night
Okay.
on Sunday, okay? Take care. If anything happens, call anytime, though. You're
Thank
okay?
you.
Kai, you're okay?
Mhm.
Okay. If any questions come up, let me know or whatever, because we have been employing a kind of hangout circumstance where we've naturalized very intense stuff.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Mhm.
And I mean by that, it would be as if we were doctors in an emergency room, then meeting for tea afterwards and having a conversation about what they experienced. And you would see what holy shit, they experienced that living and dying and trying to bring the person back and helping them out. So that's the natural. But then we're also coming from a different place, which is not around medicine as much as it is. You see that a certain illness may allow you to visit a situation in your life where you're asking those kind of questions. So there may be a certain cancer that has you asking, who am I question, what am I? So you see that there are certain situations that force you into a kind of soul searching, which is not nuts. It is around some things that your body and your being have been handling all along. But when it comes to you, you see that your body has somehow been managing living and dying in some way. But then when the question then comes to you, who am I? That's what the question of that kind of treatment is. It's a kind of who am I question. What am I? And once that question comes in, not as a literal question that there's an answer to it, but it opens up a door. The who am I question opens up a doorway of a parallel life where you see that the you is not just your identification, but that there is a parallel you that has been living in the body all along. That becomes revealed around certain times. But once it's revealed, the life starts to then be lived around that feeling. Okay, I'll see everyone. Take care.